Hi there, my name is Tim Moen. I am the leader of the Libertarian Party of Canada. And I've been asked on a fairly regular basis to comment on what I would do about the fentanyl crisis. And what a lot of people don't know is that I'm actually a firefighter paramedic. And so, in many ways, I'm on the front lines dealing with the fentanyl crisis here in Canada. I mean, over the past 2 years, I've treated countless overdoses from fentanyl. And so in this video, I thought I would address how we can deal with the fentanyl crisis and how we can deal with it both from a first aid perspective, what you can do if you witness something happen right in front of you, but what we could also do from a systemic perspective. Because frankly, a lot of the solutions I'm seeing proposed are likely to make the problem a lot worse. Now, fentanyl isn't really a new drug to me. I've been using it to treat patients for over 2 decades as a paramedic. Fentanyl is an opiate, so it's in the same class of drug as morphine, heroin, codeine, OxyContin, Percocet. And fentanyl is a great medicine to use for certain circumstances. It's very powerful, it's very fast acting, and it also has a relatively short half-life, which means its effects wear off more quickly than many other opiates. So this makes it particularly useful when dealing with severe trauma, for example. If I have a patient who has multiple fractures and I have to move them onto the stretcher or package them up onto a spine board, bounce them down the road in the ambulance, fentanyl works very well to quickly take away the pain and allow us to make that move. And, I can bring patients to the edge of consciousness with it and alleviate their suffering. In some cases, I can even use it in conjunction with a benzodiazepine like midazolam or Valium to completely sedate a patient and make them, semi-conscious for a few minutes while I perform a life-saving procedure that might be very painful or secure an invasive airway. And the properties that make fentanyl a very useful drug for me as a paramedic make it a very dangerous drug for recreational users and addicts. Opiates have the effect of depressing your central nervous system and decreasing your respiratory rate. They also cause vasodilation, which is when your blood vessels open up and drop your blood pressure. Now, think about how you feel when you get up out of a hot tub or a warm bath too quickly and you feel lightheaded. That is your blood pressure dropping because of vasodilation. You're very red, right? You're flushed, and that's because your vessels are dilated. And this is what happens when you take a large dose of opiates. So people don't die so much from the drug fentanyl as they die from the cardiovascular collapse that occurs when you simultaneously depress consciousness, respiration, and create a rapid drop in blood pressure. And oftentimes, on top of that, people also choke on their own vomit because opiates tend to cause nausea and vomiting as well. And so these people can't protect their own airway and they end up aspirating and choking on their own vomit. And here's an example of a typical call I see. Once I was called to the scene where an 18-year-old kid whose girlfriend called us said she couldn't wake him up. And she said he had snorted an Oxy 80. Now this is, an Oxy 80 is OxyContin 80 milligram tablet. And what people like to do is crush them up and snort them and get high. And unfortunately, this wasn't an Oxy 80. It was a tablet that was pressed to look like an Oxy 80, and it contained high levels of fentanyl. And when we get to the scene, this kid looks dead. I mean, he's laying motionless, ashen gray, doesn't look like he's breathing there beside his bed in his room. In fact, there's a police officer there taking crime scene photos of this dead kid lying on the floor of his room, except he wasn't quite dead. We noticed that he had a faint pulse and faint breathing, so we immediately start breathing for him. We manage his airway, and we administer the antidote to opiates, which is called naloxone. And within 2 minutes, this kid is awake and walking around his house and giving us attitude. What are we doing here? Why are we invading a space? Why should he go to the hospital? Now, this is a problem because the opiate he took could very well last longer than the antidote we gave him. In other words, he feels perfectly fine now, but when the naloxone wears off, he could very well find himself unconscious and on death's door again. And it's very difficult to convince people that they need to come to the hospital at this point because they feel perfectly fine. They don't realize that they were just on death's door. And in this particular case, the police officer showed this kid the photo he had taken of the young man looking dead. And the kid couldn't believe his eyes. I mean, he thought that the cop doctored this photo somehow at first. And he finally, reality set in that he had almost died. And that was actually him lying there on the floor. He broke down and he started crying. And of course, he agreed to come to the hospital after that. But this is a typical fentanyl overdose call. Quite often people that overdose don't realize how close to death they just came. Quite often they're angry at you for ruining their high. Quite often they don't think that they are in any danger at all. Quite often they've been defrauded by their drug dealer who tells them they're getting a relatively safe pharmaceutical grade opiate like Percocet or OxyContin, when in fact they're actually getting fentanyl. Now, where most opiates are measured in milligrams, fentanyl is measured in micrograms. And if you remember from high school math class, 1 microgram is 1,000th of a milligram. So if a tablet that contained 80 milligrams of OxyContin now contains 80 milligrams of fentanyl, you would have a tablet that is about 1,000 times as powerful as the Oxy 80. And drug dealers, they don't want to kill their customers. So what they do is they take the tablets. They don't make the tablets pure fentanyl. What they do is they try to cut it down to an equivalent amount, which in this case, they'd have to put 1,000 times less fentanyl in the same size tablet to have the same effect as the Oxy 80. So what they do is they mix, a benign adulterant in there, like maybe talcum powder or something that is relatively neutral. And then they put in a few grains of fentanyl and press it to look like a pill that is an Oxy 80. And as you can imagine, this requires a great deal of precision. And black market dealers aren't known for getting the quantity consistently correct. So 2 tablets of what appear to be Oxy 80 mixed in the same batch by the same drug dealer can have dramatically different doses. I mean, 1 pill might not give you much of a buzz at all, and the next pill you take from the same batch could actually kill you just because there's inconsistencies with the number of grains of fentanyl that get mixed into each individual pill. Now, the good news is that if you witness an opiate overdose, there's actually a lot you can do to save that person's life, even if you have no first aid equipment or naloxone available. Like I said earlier, there are 3 things that kill people in an opiate overdose. One is cardiovascular collapse, the other is decreased respiration, and the other one is choking on their own vomit. So if the person suddenly stops breathing, you can perform mouth-to-mouth respiration on them. If they no longer have a detectable pulse, you can perform chest compressions on them. If they vomit, you can roll them on their side and sweep out their airway. And these people respond very well to these basic first aid measures, much better than someone who stops breathing or loses a pulse from other causes like, say, a heart attack, where it's much more difficult to get these people to respond to CPR, for example. And naloxone really is a miracle drug if you've ever seen it work. It literally looks like you're raising someone from the dead. And naloxone is becoming widely available in many jurisdictions. It's available here in Alberta quite easily by just going to the pharmacy. And one of the problems I'm starting to see emerge now is that people are becoming, somewhat emboldened by the fact that they have the antidote right there. It gives them a false sense of security. And I've been to numerous overdoses now where an unconscious person has a naloxone kit near them. And so the problem with fentanyl is that, before you notice that you're getting high, you're unconscious and not breathing. And so they never have time to use these kits. And so I'm personally a little skeptical that having widely available naloxone is gonna solve the problem of fentanyl overdoses. But it certainly helps to have a sober, trained person with a naloxone kit nearby if you're going to be taking opiates. Okay, so that kind of outlines what we're seeing on the street. Now I'm going to put on my politician hat and talk about how we as a society might be able to go about solving this problem we're seeing. And I think it's important to understand the problem. First of all, over the last couple of decades, opiates have been widely prescribed for chronic pain. And so pharmaceutical grade opiates sold on the white market have been widely available for addicts and recreational users alike. And, until recently, you've been able to find OxyContin, Percocet, Tylenol 3 in a typical home medicine cabinet. And, if you run out, you just go to your doctor and complain about the pain you're in, and typically they give you a prescription. I don't blame doctors. They get a bad rap here, but people who seek opiates can be very convincing. And if you have the technology to take away someone's pain, it seems wrong on some level not to give it to them. And listen, there are a lot of overdoses from these pharmaceutical grade opiates, but they aren't dangerous in the way that black market opiates like fentanyl and heroin are. Drugs like OxyContin, Percocet, and T3s, they can all scratch that itch that opiate users have without causing an accidental overdose. They are sold in pill bottles with limited qualities, and the tablets are formulated in doses that are well within therapeutic ranges. And so these vendors are taking care to make sure their drugs are dispensed in a safe format. Black market dealers don't have the same incentive to make their products safe. It's not like they're going to get sued or held liable. It's not like their livelihood and reputation depends on providing customers a safe product. It's not like customers can resolve disputes they have with drug dealers and go to the police and go to the authorities and demand they shut down their operation. I mean, that just doesn't happen. So if you're in the market for an opiate, how are you going to get it? Well, currently your options are you can try to get it from your doctor, or you can go get it from a local dealer. And for years, it was relatively easy to get opiates from your doctor, but lately, regulatory agencies are cracking down on physicians prescribing opiates. And at the same time, it's becoming more difficult to get relatively safe opiates from your doctor. It's becoming increasingly easy to get dangerous opiates from black market dealers. Potent opiates like fentanyl and carfentanil are becoming easier and easier to manufacture. And because they're so potent in such small quantities, it's very easy to smuggle them into a country. You can literally mail them or put them in a tiny little packet or smuggle them in another good. You can't stop these things from coming in. I mean, if you can't stop drugs from coming into a prison, how are you going to stop them from coming into a country? So clearly, any policy that makes getting white market opiates harder to get is going to drive people to the black market to get them. And this is where the social conservative might say, well, we need to crack down and make punishment and sentencing harsher to discourage drug dealing and using. But there are a number of problems with this. And the first problem is that it actually increases the level of violence and criminality that we see. Cracking down means that many dealers, low-level dealers, get locked up, they get run out of business, but the demand is still there. And so people rise up to meet that demand, and the people that rise up are the ones that are the most ruthless and violent. They're willing to take risks and use violence to solve disputes. And they're attracted to this market because prohibition raises the price of these drugs, and that's very attractive, for someone to want to become a dealer because they can make a big profit if they're willing to use violence, if they're willing to be a hardcore criminal. And so that's why we see more violence and criminality when we get tough on these things. And of course, the other problem with prosecuting a drug war and getting tough on drug use is that it costs a lot of taxpayer money. So it doesn't work, and it costs a lot of money. And if we want to be serious about getting rid of the criminality, addiction, and overdosing that occurs because of the black market, we have to make the white market far more accessible for users. I mean, the white market has to be at least as easy as the black market to access, or people will simply go to the black market and criminals will flourish. And, in Canada here, I know we're talking about legalizing cannabis right now. And the arguments all kind of center around how benign cannabis is. It doesn't cause harm. And it certainly causes far less harm than alcohol. So why on earth is it prohibited? Now, obviously, I'm in favor of cannabis legalization. However, I'm not a huge fan of this argument because it concedes an assumption that prohibition is justified if drugs are dangerous. We need to be getting it through people's thick heads that government prohibitions make the problems worse. Repeat after me. Government prohibitions make the drug problem worse. It's precisely because a drug is dangerous that it ought to be legalized as a priority. Seattle's ex-police chief, Norm Stamper, once said that hard drugs ought to be legalized first if we're triaging which prohibitions to repeal. Because dangerous drugs coupled with prohibition is an extremely deadly combination, not only for the users, but also all the people around them in the neighborhoods, the kids that are collateral damage in the war on drugs. Now, you don't have to take my word for it or Norm Stamper's word for it. You can just look at real-world examples. I mean, decriminalizing drugs has dramatically reduced crime and addiction rates in Portugal and Switzerland. So legalization can eliminate much of the criminality and get rid of some of the factors that contribute to increasing addiction and increased harm. But for me, this isn't good enough. I'm not interested in a society full of hedonistic libertines where there's a drug den on every corner or long lineups at the liquor store. I want a society that promotes character and responsibility. Now, obviously, my contention is that government cannot compel improved character and responsibility. It cannot compel people to stop being addicts. And so if I'm interested in promoting the type of society I describe, I have to understand not only how I contribute to the promotion of drug addiction and crime by supporting prohibition, but I also have to understand how I can promote healthy choices and the development of character. I have to understand what causes the demand for drugs like opiates in the first place. And we've been fed a lot of lies and myths about drugs. For example, the idea that one hit of crystal meth or crack cocaine or heroin can cause and create addiction. Well, the evidence suggests that the majority of people who have tried these drugs do not become addicted. The vast majority of hard drug users are not addicts at all and only use occasionally. But what explains the percentage of people who try a substance and then get hooked and addicted to it? Well, more evidence is emerging to explain why certain people become addicted. For example, rat studies conducted, I think in the early 70s, concluded that most rats, when given a choice between drugged water and regular water, would choose the drugged water. They'd get hooked and then die from lethargy or overdose. And so scientists reasonably concluded that it was the substance that caused the addiction. However, when the study was repeated a few decades later, I think in Vancouver, it was shown that rats who were given a much healthier environment, an environment they called Rat Park, where they could play and mate and have, everything a rat could want for a good rat life. Well, these rats rarely chose the drugged water. So in other words, you put a rat in a cage and it gets addicted. You give a rat a happy, healthy environment and it doesn't. So here it seems that environment has more to do with addiction than substance. And, addiction specialist and psychiatrist Gabor Mate, who operates his practice out of the Portland Hotel in Vancouver, BC, testifies that he has never met a heroin addict who doesn't have severe maternal attachment issues. And he goes on to say that this makes sense in light of studies that show that the same parts of the brain that light up when an infant locks eyes with its mom in that loving maternal gaze, the same parts of the brain light up in an opiate addict's brain when they take a hit of opiate. So in many ways, the opiate addict who has never had that tender maternal connection meets heroin or some other opiate for the first time, they are getting the very thing that they've been missing their whole life. And so this is, his explanation as to how environment contributes to the idea of drug addiction. So, the adverse childhood adverse childhood experiences study confirm this. The idea that people who have adverse childhood have like 400% increased risk of criminality and drug addiction. So, it's important to understand that the opposite of addiction isn't sobriety, but rather connection. And addicts who view drug addiction as a battle between, say, their willpower and the temptation to use are likely to lose that battle. Programs in Switzerland and Portugal and Gabor Mate's work here in Canada has shown how addicts are actually able to kick their addiction for good. Now, if you look at Portugal, it's true that, for example, we see increased drug use. There's something like 6% more people who have tried drugs because they're more readily available. But at the same time, we see a dramatic plummet in the addiction rates. It's been cut by 50%. And this is a staggering number. Crime, addiction, overdoses have all plummeted. And this is attributed in large part to not only a reduction in a punitive legal environment that in many ways inflicts the same types of traumas that contributed to the addiction in the first place, but also to resources that connect users to a community. Once addicts get meaningful work and community, they tend to stop using. Their desire to use goes away. They aren't engaging in a battle of willpower versus temptation anymore because they found connection with people, connection with purpose. So addiction isn't easy to overcome. And, the idea that we can fix it by asking government to implement some rules is itself an addictive opiate, isn't it? A government is the opiate of the masses. If you have a fear or anxiety, here, have some government. Afraid of barbarians? Here's some government for you. Afraid of climate catastrophe? Here, chum, have some government. Afraid the poor are going to starve? I've got some government for you, pal. We are addicted to the illusion of quick and easy fixes. Have a headache? Here's a pill. Feeling blue? Here, have this pill. Don't read the warning label. So we have this weird hypocritical double standard when it comes to drugs. We're constantly fed this narrative that drugs are addictive and that the people who sell them are bad guys. Yet we have no problem with liquor store owners or pharmacists selling these same things. We demonize crystal meth on the one hand and prescribe it an almost identical substance called Adderall to our kids on the other hand. So which is it? Is it a medication that helps kids focus, or is it the most addictive drug on the planet that will turn you from this into this? Well, notice that in both cases, drugs are used to help us avoid taking on responsibility. In the addict, it helps them avoid the work they need to do to find the connection they need. In teachers and parents, Adderall helps us avoid having to look in the mirror and see the ways that we failed our children. Adderall prevents us from having to consider pulling our kids out of school and structuring an environment where they might flourish. It's easier just to drug them into conformity. My great-grandfather had a farm in Stalinist Russia, and he wrote in his memoirs about what he saw as communism starting to take more and more from his society. And he saw people losing hope, being driven into poverty and dependence on the state. And, to his Christian sensibilities, the idea of communism seemed reasonable at first, from those according to their abilities, to those according to their need. His faith encouraged charity, but he saw how compulsion and state power corrupted this very noble virtue. People weren't giving as an expression of their faith anymore, or of their personal commitment to improving their character and being a good community member. They were being taken from, and he saw lineups for liquor become longer and longer. And he described what he was seeing as people anesthetizing themselves from the pain of their existence. Those were the words he used. Nearly 100 years ago, my great-grandfather noticed that the environment people are subject to can lead them to substance abuse problems. So if we are interested in a society where we see less addiction, my suggestion isn't just that we repeal prohibitions and compulsion, but rather that we work on our own character as individuals, that we commit ourselves to responsibility for our own lives and the lives of people in our community, that we shun the temptation of immediate gratification, of asking government to fix problems for us, and we commit to the hard work of providing those solutions ourselves. Banning pill presses, government handing out naloxone kits, tightening border security, increasing punishment, getting tough on crime. These are all measures that allow us to avoid taking personal responsibility, just like drugs allow us to avoid taking personal responsibility. The problem we are facing has very little to do with a ready supply of an addictive substance and everything to do with the demand for these substances. And I personally look forward to the day where I don't have to do CPR on another victim of our addiction to the shunning of personal responsibility.